Real nightmares. The village sat nestled in the shadow of an ancient forest, cut off from the world by towering trees and jagged mountains. Its people were bound to an old and unspoken tradition. Every 30 years, when the blood moon rose, a group of hunters was sent into the forest. There, they were tasked with hunting a creature cursed by the very land they lived on. A creature that the elders claimed could bring ruin if not slain. Elias, a reluctant participant, stood among the chosen hunters, the weight of his family's history heavy on his shoulders. His father, a celebrated hunter, had disappeared during the last blood moon ritual. The mystery of his fate haunted Elias, gnawing at his resolve. He had grown up hearing whispered tales of that night, and now it was his turn. The village felt different as the blood moon drew near. The usual air of grim determination was replaced with something darker, more fearful. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries strange and mournful. Crops wilted in the fields, and an unnatural chill clung to the air. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this year's ritual was not like the others. He found his father's journal, hidden beneath old hunting gear, filled with cryptic warnings. The night of the blood moon arrived, and a thick silence blanketed the village. At the sacred clearing, the chosen hunters gathered under the towering pines, their faces illuminated by the eerie red glow of the rising moon. Elias stood among them, gripping his father's old hunting knife, the handle worn from years of use. The elders, dressed in dark cloaks, began their chant, a low, rhythmic hum that sent shivers down Elias's spine. The ritual was brief but heavy with purpose. An elder, his face gaunt and eyes hollow, stepped forward. "Tonight, you must hunt," he rasped, his voice cracking. "The curse grows stronger with each passing blood moon. Fail, and it will consume us all." Elias glanced at the other hunters. Some were seasoned, their eyes cold with focus. Others were younger, trembling with barely concealed fear. The air was thick with dread, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for the blood to spill. The hunters were given their weapons, bows, knives, and spears handed down through generations, and sent off into the night. The villagers watched in silence, their faces pale in the moon's crimson light. As Elias and the group ventured into the dark woods, the trees seemed to close in around them. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. Elias could feel the weight of his father's journal pressing against his chest, its cryptic words echoing in his mind. Something was out there, waiting. The forest grew darker the further they ventured, the moon's red glow barely piercing the thick canopy. The hunters moved cautiously, their eyes darting between the trees. The air was heavy, suffocating with an unnatural stillness, as though the woods were holding their breath. Suddenly, one of the younger hunters froze, his hand raised to signal the group. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a nearby tree. Carved into the bark were strange, jagged symbols, runes that none of them recognized, but all instinctively feared. Elias felt a shiver run through him. The symbols were fresh, their edges raw and bleeding sap, as though something had marked its territory only moments before. They pressed on, but the unease deepened. Not long after, they came across a mutilated deer carcass lying in the middle of their path. Its body was twisted, torn open in ways that defied nature. Deep, slashing wounds ran across its flanks, the skin peeled back as if by cruel, deliberate hands. The stench of death was overpowering. One of the older hunters bent down to examine it, his face grim. "This is no animal," he muttered. "Something's playing with us." Tension rippled through the group. Elias's thoughts returned to his father's journal, the warnings about something growing stronger. He clenched his fists, fighting back the rising tide of fear. In the distance, a shadow darted between the trees, too fast and too large to be anything natural. The creature was out there, watching, and it was waiting for them to make the first move. The forest, once suffocating in its silence, now seemed alive with ominous sounds. Twigs snapped underfoot, though no one moved. Every breath felt stolen, each step a gamble. The hunters were no longer pursuing their prey. They were being stalked. As the group pressed deeper into the woods, Elias felt the weight of eyes on him, as if the creature's gaze pierced through the trees. Whispers, faint and indistinct, seemed to rise on the wind. They weren't words, but emotions, fear, longing, pain. One hunter, a man named Harlan, suddenly froze. His face drained of color as he cocked his head, listening intently. I hear her," he muttered, his eyes wide with shock. "My wife, she's calling me." Before anyone could stop him, Harlan broke away from the group, disappearing into the shadows. They chased after him, calling his name, but it was too late. A blood-curdling scream tore through the night, silencing the forest. When they found him, his body was mangled beyond recognition. His face twisted in a grotesque mask of terror, and his limbs were splayed unnaturally, arranged in a manner that spoke of something far more intelligent and cruel than any animal. The remaining hunters were silent, paralyzed by fear. The creature was no longer just a threat. It was a terror that none of them could escape. The death of Harlan shattered what little courage remained in the group. Panic set in, and the hunters began to argue, their voices frantic and hoarse. Some wanted to flee back to the village, while others insisted they push forward, convinced that turning back would only invite more death. Elias stood apart, silent, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, a truth hidden just out of reach. The weight of his father's journal pressed against his chest. With trembling hands, Elias pulled it out and flipped to the final entries. By the dim light of the blood moon, he read the last words his father had written before his disappearance. "The curse is a hunger, one that grows with each blood moon. We do not hunt it, we feed it. Every life it takes makes it stronger. The village offers its best hunters, not for protection, but as tribute. The creature cannot be killed, only sacrificed to." The truth hit Elias like a blow. The ritual wasn't a hunt, it was an offering. The creature thrived on their fear, their deaths, their souls. Each blood moon, the village sent hunters into the forest knowing they were condemning them to die, just as Elias's father had died. He felt the icy grip of realization tighten around him. The only way to break the cycle was to stop feeding the creature. But how? A distant snarl pulled Elias from his thoughts. The creature was close now, its presence heavy and suffocating. The remaining hunters were fraying at the edges, desperate, their eyes wide with terror. Elias knew what had to be done. "We can't kill it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear roiling inside him. "But I can end it." Before anyone could stop him, Elias moved toward the creature's lair, a jagged outcrop deep in the forest where the trees twisted unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with rot, the earth itself pulsing with a dark, malignant energy. As Elias approached, the creature emerged, its form shifting, an embodiment of all their worst fears. Elias held his ground. "Take me," he whispered. In that moment, he understood his father's fate. His sacrifice would end the blood moon hunts, freeing the village from its curse. As the creature closed in, Elias didn't flinch. He felt its cold breath on his skin, saw its monstrous form envelop him. And then, darkness. The blood moon had sunk low on the horizon by the time the sole surviving hunter stumbled back to the village. His clothes were torn, his skin streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were empty. The villagers gathered around him, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and dread. The blood moon hunts were over, but at what cost? The survivor could barely speak, his voice ragged and broken as he recounted Elias's final moments. He gave himself to it," the man whispered, his hands shaking. "The creature, it's gone. I think it's over." The elders nodded solemnly, but there was no celebration. The weight of generations of fear and sacrifice hung heavy over the village, and while the curse seemed broken, there was a lingering unease, as if the air itself refused to let go of its dark history. Later, the survivor stood alone by the river, watching the reflection of the last fading glimmers of the blood moon ripple across the water's surface. As he leaned closer, he saw something, a distortion in his own reflection. For a fleeting moment, his face twisted, becoming something monstrous. A distant howl echoed from the forest, low and mournful. The curse might not have ended after all. Edward Drayton stepped into his mansion, carrying the weight of another successful expedition. His boots, still dusted with the red soil of Africa, echoed through the grand hallway as he moved toward his sanctuary, his trophy room. Here, every wall was lined with the spoils of decades spent pursuing the most dangerous creatures nature could offer. Lions, tigers, bears, all frozen in time, forever under his control. Edward took a deep breath as he surveyed the room, pride swelling in his chest. This room was his legacy, a testament to his skill and dominance. But today, something new sat on his desk, a small, intricately carved necklace made of bones and beads, an artifact he had taken from the neck of a dead shaman in the African wilderness. It was a simple piece, but there was something about it that drew his attention, something unsettling. He hadn't been able to resist bringing it back. The air in the trophy room felt cold, colder than usual. Edward brushed it off, convinced it was just the night air slipping in through the cracks of the old mansion. He hung the necklace on the wall near his latest acquisition, a massive elephant head, its tusks gleaming in the dim light. Satisfied, Edward turned to leave, but not before casting one last glance at the rows of lifeless eyes staring back at him. For a brief moment, he could have sworn they followed him. He paused, shivering despite himself, then shook his head. "Nothing but shadows," he muttered, pulling the door shut behind him. The wind outside howled as he made his way upstairs. In the silence of his home, the faint creak of the floorboards echoed, trailing behind him like a whisper. The next morning, Edward sat at the head of his long dining table, sipping coffee as sunlight filtered through the large windows. His housekeeper, Miriam, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a deep knowledge of old traditions, entered the room. Her usual composed expression shifted as her gaze fell on him. "Sir, that necklace you brought back?" she began, her voice low. "It's dangerous. The shamans of that land. What you took was sacred. You need to return it." Edward chuckled, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Miriam, it's just an old trinket. Superstitions won't haunt me. I've faced lions and tigers. I doubt a necklace will pose much of a threat." She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes lingered on his, searching for some hint of understanding. "It's not just a necklace, sir. It holds the spirits of the animals you've killed. If it stays here, they'll come for you." His laugh died down, replaced by a smirk. "I've faced worse than spirits. Now, let's drop the nonsense." Miriam frowned but said no more. She turned and left the room quietly, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. As the door closed behind her, the house felt unnaturally still. The quiet settled heavily around him, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. That night, when Edward lay in bed, he was woken by the softest of sounds, something being dragged across the floor downstairs. He tensed, listening closely, but after a long pause, silence reclaimed the house. The next day, Edward strode confidently into his trophy room, still dismissing Miriam's warnings as mere folklore. He scanned the familiar scene, the gleaming eyes of his conquests, the rows of mounted heads. But something was wrong. The lion, his prized trophy from the African savannah, was gone. He stood frozen in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the lion's head should have been. The thick, majestic mane, the ferocious teeth that had once roared through the wild. All of it vanished. Only the wooden mount remained, with deep scratches where the lion had once been fixed. Edward's pulse quickened. "This can't be right," he muttered, stepping into the room. He carefully inspected the walls, looking for some sign of tampering. There was no sign of forced entry. Everything else seemed in its place. "Maybe the staff moved it," he whispered, but doubt began to creep into his mind. Miriam's warning gnawed at him. The thought of her words made him clench his fists, refusing to let superstition shake him. That night, while he sat in his study, the house creaked louder than usual. It seemed to breathe, groaning under the weight of something unseen. Then came the sound again, low, guttural, almost like growling. He rose from his chair, straining to listen. His eyes darted to the door. For a brief moment, He imagined the missing lion stalking him through the halls, its golden eyes reflecting the flickering light. Edward shook his head, muttering curses at his own fear. He grabbed his rifle and stormed through the mansion, determined to find the source of the noise. But as he wandered the empty corridors, only silence followed him. Sleep eluded Edward that night. He lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling as the house creaked and groaned in the darkness. Each sound made his pulse quicken, but no matter how hard he listened, he couldn't pinpoint the source. Hours passed before he finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a sharp noise from the hallway outside his bedroom. It wasn't just a creak. This time, it was heavy, deliberate, like footsteps. Grabbing his rifle from beside the bed, Edward swung open the door and stalked into the corridor, eyes scanning the shadows. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He descended the grand staircase, his heart pounding in his ears. Every instinct told him something was wrong. When he reached the bottom floor, he saw it. A hulking figure, standing in the dim light of the hallway. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. His grizzly bear trophy. The massive beast that had once been mounted on his wall was standing on all fours, its fur matted and bloody, its glass eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The stitching where it had been preserved was still visible, but now it hung loosely from its decayed flesh. Edward raised his rifle, but the sight before him froze him in place. The bear let out a low, guttural growl, its dead eyes locking onto him. With a sharp breath, Edward fired. The bullet hit the beast square in the chest, and it collapsed with a sickening thud. He stood still, waiting for it to move again. But the bear lay motionless, its glassy eyes staring into nothingness. Slowly, Edward approached the body, his hands trembling as he prodded it with the barrel of his gun. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the bear's body vanished, leaving only a pool of blood on the floor. Edward stumbled backward, his heart racing. His mind raced for an explanation, but none came. He was no longer in control of his domain. His trophies, his symbols of dominance, were rising against him. As dawn approached, Edward retreated to his study, his confidence shattered. He sat in the dark, gripping his rifle, watching the shadows shift around him. The hunter had become the hunted. By morning, Edward's mind teetered on the edge of disbelief and terror. The vision of the grizzly bear, the blood, the growl, played over and over again in his mind, leaving him unable to think of anything else. Something had to explain this. Something logical. He couldn't accept that the supernatural had invaded his life, not after all the years of conquering nature's fiercest predators. Desperate for answers, Edward called on an old acquaintance, Dr. Collins, an anthropologist who had studied ancient African cultures. When he arrived, Edward wasted no time explaining the strange events, omitting none of the chilling details. Dr. Collins listened in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. Finally, he stood up and walked toward the trophy room, studying the tribal necklace Edward had displayed. "This artifact," Collins began, "it's no ordinary piece. You should never have brought it here." Edward scoffed, though his confidence had worn thin. Miriam said something similar. "It's just folklore." Collins shook his head gravely. "It's much more than that. This necklace was a protective talisman, meant to keep the spirits of the wilderness in balance. By taking it, you've unleashed the spirits of the creatures you've killed. They are bound to that room, and to you." Edward's face darkened. "You're saying I'm being haunted by the animals I've hunted?" "Yes," Collins replied, his voice low. "The shaman who once wore this protected the animals you killed. Without him, the spirits want vengeance. They'll stop at nothing." Edward stood silent, anger building beneath his skin. He refused to believe his life's work could be his downfall. "I won't be beaten by some curse," he spat. "I'll destroy it." But as Dr. Collins left, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far beyond his control. That night, the mansion was deathly quiet, but the air crackled with tension. Edward sat in his study, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the doorway. His mind replayed Dr. Collins' words, but Edward refused to surrender to fear. He was a hunter, a conqueror of nature's fiercest beasts. He wouldn't be intimidated by what he still considered illusions, spirits or no spirits. Hours passed, and the silence grew unbearable. Then, the sounds returned. Low growls, the scrape of claws against wood. Edward stood, gripping his rifle tighter, as he moved toward the trophy room, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the door, the air inside was thick with a malevolent energy. He pushed it open slowly, the creaking hinges echoing like a warning. The room, once a proud display of his triumphs, now felt more like a crypt. Shadows danced across the lifeless eyes of the mounted animals. Then, as if in a nightmare, they began to move. The heads of the animals, lions, tigers, wolves, turned in unison, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The stitched bodies of his trophies, grotesque and misshapen, shifted and twisted as they freed themselves from their mounts. The smell of decay filled the room as the creatures, half alive, half dead, rose, surrounding him. Edward's hands shook as he fired his rifle. The shot rang out, hitting a snarling tiger square in the head. But instead of falling, the beast roared and lunged toward him. Edward dodged just in time, retreating as the other animals closed in. In the chaos, Edward realized something terrifying. The more he killed them, the stronger they became. Each shot seemed to restore them, their bodies growing more twisted and violent. It was as though the spirits within them were feeding off his fear, growing more powerful with every attempt to fight back. Desperation clawed at Edward's mind. He stumbled out of the trophy room, panting, his back pressed against the hallway wall. The creatures followed, their once proud forms now nightmarish aberrations, dripping blood and growling with rage. The hunter had no control left. The very trophies he had mounted in victory were now his executioners. Edward sprinted for the only refuge he could think of, the study, where the fire roared in the hearth. He needed to destroy the cursed necklace, to end this once and for all. But as he bolted through the halls, the low growls of the creatures echoed closer and closer behind him. Edward burst into the study, slamming the door behind him. The roaring fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, but it wasn't enough to chase away the terror that gripped him. He tore the cursed necklace from its place on the mantel and hurled it into the flames, watching as the beads and bones blackened and charred. For a moment, silence. He exhaled, his pulse still racing. Could it really be over? Then came a deafening crash. The study door exploded inward, with splintering, as the twisted animals forced their way in. Their bodies contorted unnaturally, parts of them still stitched together from their taxidermy, yet alive with an unnatural rage. Edward fired his rifle at the first creature to charge through. A massive bear, but it barely slowed. He was trapped. Desperately, he grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the creatures. But the flames only seemed to fuel their fury. The cursed spirits were beyond control now, beyond reasoning. Edward realized, with a crushing sense of finality, that there was no escape. His trophies, his legacy of death, had come for him, and they would not stop until he paid for the lives he had taken. The bear lunged, claws raking across his chest, sending him crashing to the floor. The other animals closed in, their glowing eyes full of vengeance. As Edward lay there, gasping, he caught sight of the trophy room from across the hall, its shadows deepening, swallowing him whole. The hunter had become the final trophy. The once mighty mansion of Edward Drayton was reduced to smoldering rubble. The fire had consumed nearly everything. The elegant rooms, the grand staircase, the priceless trophies, all gone. Smoke still curled from the charred remains as dawn broke over the desolate landscape. Among the ashes, the twisted forms of the animals had vanished, leaving no trace of the horrific night. But one thing had survived, the cursed necklace. It lay untouched in the debris, its beads and bones gleaming eerily in the soft morning light, as if the fire itself had recoiled from its power. Hours later, a lone passerby, a hiker exploring the countryside, stumbled upon the ruins. Curious, he sifted through the wreckage, picking up pieces of burned wood and debris. His eyes caught the faint glimmer of something half buried in the ash. Kneeling down, He pulled out the necklace, examining it with mild interest. Strange, he muttered to himself, brushing off the soot. Looks ancient. Without a second thought, he tucked the artifact into his pocket, glancing once more at the ruins before continuing on his way. He had no idea what he carried with him, nor the dark legacy that followed it. The cycle had not ended. The spirits that once tormented Edward Drayton were now bound to a new life, waiting, watching, until the next hunt began. The air in the small town buzzed with excitement. It was that time of year again, when the hunting festival brought everyone together, celebrating the old traditions passed down for generations. The streets were lined with stalls selling venison and boar, while children ran through the crowds wearing carved wooden masks of wolves and deer. But beneath the laughter and festive decorations, there was a palpable tension, a quiet unease shared among the older residents who remembered the darker side of the festival's history. Ethan stood at the edge of the town square, watching the festivities unfold. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, a weight he'd grown used to over the years. His father had carried it once, a respected hunter whose disappearance during this very festival still cast a long shadow over Ethan's life. It had been 10 years, but the whispers never fully died down. Some said his father had fallen to an animal's attack. Others suggested he had simply gotten lost in the endless, untamed woods. But Ethan couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was more to it, something no one wanted to admit. Ready for the big day? A voice called from behind him. It was Jake, one of the older hunters, grinning as he clapped Ethan on the shoulder. You've got your father's skill, no doubt. This year, you'll finally show everyone. Ethan forced a smile. Yeah, maybe. Just remember. Jake's tone grew serious as he glanced toward the forest that loomed in the distance. Those woods, they have their secrets. Some things in there. They don't want to be found. Ethan nodded, but dismissed the warning as superstition. Still, as he looked at the thick, dark trees, a chill ran down his spine. The next morning, Ethan joined the group of hunters at the edge of the forest. The early light filtered through the trees, casting long, thin shadows that danced with the mist clinging to the ground. Each hunter prepared their gear in silence, the usual chatter subdued. For all the festival's cheer, the hunt itself was a more solemn affair, especially this deep into the woods, where even seasoned men knew to be cautious. Ethan checked his rifle, making sure everything was in place. He caught sight of Jake further down the line, adjusting his bow. The older man gave him a nod of encouragement, but Ethan's focus remained on the forest before them. The trees seemed to loom larger up close, as though they could swallow a man whole without anyone noticing. That feeling of being watched crept back, the same unease that had prickled his skin the night before. As they ventured deeper, the light from the open fields behind them faded, and the canopy above thickened, muting the sounds of the world outside. It wasn't long before the hunters spread out, each taking their own path to increase their chances of a good kill. Ethan walked alone, his boots crunching softly over the undergrowth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. Then, just ahead, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a deer, its silhouette still and strange between the trees. But as he raised his rifle to his shoulder, the creature's eyes glowed unnaturally, staring right back at him. He froze, heart pounding. The deer didn't move. It just watched, its eyes unnerving in their intensity. Ethan felt rooted to the spot, his finger hovering over the trigger but unable to squeeze. In the next instant, the deer turned and vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, an uneasy chill settling in his bones. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but the nagging feeling of being watched stayed with him as he continued deeper into the woods. As Ethan moved deeper into the woods, the towering trees seemed to close in around him, blocking out even the faintest traces of sunlight. His steps grew slower, more deliberate, as the silence pressed down harder, heavier. He couldn't shake the memory of the deer. Those glowing eyes still burned in his mind. Shaking his head, he tried to push the image away, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, but his gut said otherwise. Suddenly, His foot caught on something. He stumbled, catching himself just in time, and looked down to see what had tripped him. There, half buried in the earth, was a hunting knife. The handle was worn and rusted, the blade dark with age, but Ethan recognized it instantly. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father's knife. His breath quickened as he crouched to pick it up. He turned it over in his hands, a wave of unease washing over him. His father had been carrying this the day he disappeared. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. The blade was far too weathered to have been left here recently, but there it was, unmistakable, in his grasp. A twig snapped behind him. Ethan's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. Slowly, he rose to his feet, scanning the dense woods around him. His eyes strained to catch any movement, but all he could see was the endless stretch of trees, dark and foreboding. Then came the whisper. At first, it was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves. But as Ethan stood there, frozen in place, it grew clearer. A voice, low, barely audible, seemed to drift on the wind. "The hunter will be hunted." His heart thudded in his chest as the words echoed around him. The cold air clung to his skin, the feeling of being watched intensifying. He wanted to dismiss it, to convince himself it was all in his head, but something about the woods felt wrong now, twisted. That night, sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of the forest. In his nightmares, the animals he and his father had hunted appeared before him, but they were distorted, their bodies grotesque and human-like. They surrounded him, eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the deer he'd seen earlier. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the sound of whispering still ringing in his ears. The forest was no longer just a hunting ground. Something else lived here, something ancient, and it was watching him. The following morning, Ethan set out early, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest was quiet, as always, but now the silence seemed more deliberate, like the woods were waiting. He could no longer pretend the strange occurrences were just in his head. There was something lurking, watching his every move. As he ventured further, Ethan noticed the faint trail of footprints along the forest floor. Bare feet, large and unmistakably human. His pulse quickened. No one from the hunting group would be walking barefoot out here. With his rifle at the ready, he followed the trail cautiously. Minutes passed, and soon the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. Ethan froze at the sight before him. 3 other hunters from the festival stood there, but something was wrong. Their bodies moved stiffly, their heads twitching unnaturally. Their eyes, glazed over, vacant, stared off into nothingness. Ethan's stomach lurched. He took a step forward and called out softly, "Jake?" One of the men turned to him, but there was no recognition in his eyes. His face, slack and emotionless, made Ethan's blood run cold. Before he could react, the man raised his rifle and aimed directly at Ethan. Ethan dove to the ground just as a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past his head and slamming into a nearby tree. Panic surged through him. These weren't the men he knew. They had become something else, something controlled by a force far darker than the forest itself. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He weaved between the trees, the crack of branches behind him signaling that the hunters were in pursuit. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if they were being driven by something unseen, something not of this world. His mind raced, piecing together the warning from last night. The hunter will be hunted. Desperation clawed at Ethan as he realized the truth. The woods were exacting their revenge. The spirits of the animals his town had hunted for generations were now possessing the hunters, turning them into vessels of vengeance. Ethan's family had been part of the hunting festival for decades. His father's disappearance, it wasn't an accident. It was the forest reclaiming what was owed. As Ethan ran, a chilling thought struck him. If the forest had taken his father, would it come for him next? He could feel them getting closer, the possessed hunters now only a few steps behind. Their once human forms now twisted and monstrous, driven by a primal fury that sent terror rippling through his veins. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning from the effort. But there was no turning back. With his options narrowing, Ethan ducked into a narrow crevice between two towering rocks, barely squeezing himself into the gap. The hunters ran past, their hollow eyes scanning the woods but missing his hiding place. He pressed his back against the cold stone, trying to slow his breathing, the terror still tightening around his chest like a vice. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just being hunted by his fellow men. The forest itself was alive with a force older than time, and it was coming for him, just as it had come for his father. Ethan remained hidden between the rocks, his breath shallow, heart pounding as he listened for any sign of the hunters. The forest had fallen deathly silent, a sharp contrast to the frenzied chase just moments earlier. He felt the weight of the woods closing in around him, the realization settling deeper. There was no escaping this hunt. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan emerged cautiously from his hiding place. He could no longer hear the hunters nearby, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Gripping his rifle tightly, he pressed onward, moving through the dense underbrush with deliberate steps. He knew now that the only way to survive was to confront whatever had claimed these woods. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan found himself drawn to a dark, narrow path he hadn't noticed before. Something deep inside pulled him forward, an instinct as old as the forest itself. His hands trembled, but he knew he had no other choice. The trees opened into a large clearing. At the center stood a figure, half human, half animal, its body twisted and malformed. Its eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the deer he had seen the day before. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat as the figure turned to face him. It was his father, or what was left of him. The creature's body was monstrous, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a grotesque blend of man and beast. But beneath the horror, Ethan recognized the remnants of his father's features. His eyes, though hollow, held the same sadness that Ethan had seen so many times before. The creature spoke, its voice a low, rasping growl. "You've come to finish what we started, haven't you?" Ethan's heart twisted in his chest. This wasn't just about the hunt anymore. The forest hadn't simply claimed his father. It had turned him into the very thing it was using to exact its revenge. The curse had warped him, consumed him, and now it demanded Ethan pay the same price. "I didn't come here to kill you," Ethan managed, his voice strained. "I came to understand." His father's monstrous form shifted, crouching low, eyes locked on Ethan. "There is no understanding," it hissed. "Only the blood that has been spilled, over and over. The animals, the land, they remember, and they will never stop hunting." The words sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. He had always thought of the hunting festival as tradition, something tied to pride and survival. But now he saw the truth. It had always been a cycle of violence, one that his father had tried to escape and failed. And now it was his turn to face it. Ethan slowly lowered his rifle, realizing that shooting his father wouldn't break the curse. Violence had created this nightmare, and violence would only feed it. But what choice did he have? In one final, desperate act, Ethan called out, "What do you want from me?" The creature, once his father, hesitated. Its eyes flickered, almost human again. "A sacrifice," it growled, "to end what we started." Ethan's mind raced, and for the first time, he understood. The curse wasn't just on the land. It was on him, on his family, on everyone who had taken part in the hunt. The only way to break it was to offer up the very thing the forest had claimed before, his life. Ethan stood motionless, the weight of the forest pressing down on him. His father's monstrous form loomed in the fading light, the once familiar features distorted by the curse. The words echoed in his mind, "A sacrifice to end what we started." He knew there was no running from this. His father hadn't disappeared by accident. He had been claimed by the forest, consumed by the spirits of the animals they had hunted. Ethan had inherited that same curse, and the only way to stop the cycle was to offer himself in return. Slowly, he laid his rifle on the ground. His father's twisted figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes locked on him. Ethan's heart raced, but his mind was calm. This was the only way. He could feel the ancient forces of the forest closing in, demanding retribution for generations of violence. "Take me," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, "but let the others go." The creature paused, its monstrous face contorting with some semblance of emotion. For a brief moment, the glow in its eyes dimmed, and Ethan could almost see the man his father once was. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, the wind picking up as if the forest itself had heard his plea. In an instant, Ethan was pulled forward by an unseen force, his body rigid as the cold, dark energy of the forest wrapped around him. His father's form began to blur, shifting between human and beast, as the spirits of the animals, their shapes shadowy and indistinct, swirled around them both. Ethan felt his own body being drawn into the vortex, the weight of the curse pulling him down into the earth. His father's voice echoed one last time. "You've done what I couldn't. You've broken the cycle." The forest erupted with a low, mournful howl as the spirits dissipated, fading into the air. Ethan's vision blurred, and the world around him began to dissolve. As his consciousness slipped away, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The curse had been lifted, and the hunt had finally come to an end. Back in town, the hunters who had been possessed returned to their senses. They stood in the woods, dazed and confused, as if waking from a nightmare. Jake, now free from the curse's grasp, looked around frantically, searching for Ethan. But Ethan was gone. Word quickly spread through the town that the curse had been broken, though no one could fully explain how. Some said Ethan had made a noble sacrifice, while others whispered that he had simply disappeared, just like his father before him. The forest, now quiet and still, seemed to return to its natural state, but something felt different. The hunters spoke of a lingering presence, a shadow in the trees that watched over them, ensuring the curse did not return. Every year, during the hunting festival, some claimed to see a figure at the edge of the woods, a man, half hidden in shadow, standing silently among the trees. They said he bore the same glowing eyes as the animals that once haunted the forest, a silent guardian watching over the land. And on nights when the wind howled through the trees, some swore they heard his voice, faint and distant, whispering from deep within the woods. The hunter will always be hunted.